Thanks for coming. It's really great to kick off this spring season's Phoenix Poets Literary Festival with a reading by a poet who I feel multiple kinds of connection to and have for a long time, our Pearl Andelson Sherry Memorial visiting writer, Vijay Seshadri. Maybe I should take a moment to thank the Sherry family for making this event possible. Every year we're able to bring a celebrated major, I was going to say American, but sometimes they're international poets to the University of Chicago for a poetry reading and engagement with our students. Thanks to the bequest of Pearl Andelson Sherry. She was a University of Chicago student and went on to work in poetry publishing as an assistant editor and published some of her first poems during her time in Chicago, and whose gift made this event possible. So without any further ado, and I hope that you'll all join us for the amazing array of events that we have tomorrow and Friday that will be featuring poets from the Phoenix Poets book series, has recently been relaunched at the University of Chicago Press. Haidang Fan, a remarkable translator and poet who's also visiting, will be talking about translation with us, and many other guests over the next 2 days. Midway through Vijay Seshadri's latest collection, That Was Now, This Is Then, the poet holds himself to account for making a performance of mourning his dead father. I wasn't just feeling grief, but congratulating myself for it. I was seeing myself as the star of my loss, its protagonist, treading the boards, pacing under the proscenium arch of bereavement. Some part of me was saying, finally, reality. I've heard so much about it. It requires a certain remove from oneself to watch oneself pacing under the proscenium arch of bereavement, and a further remove to recognize how this dramatization of the self might cause a separation of self from self that was making apparent another person underneath. Seshadri is our preeminent dramaturge of philosophical illumination. Birth and death are just so many theatrical entrances and exits in this writer's metaphysical stagecraft. Another person suddenly arrived inside me, Seshadri goes on to write of his grieving. Another person, as real as the person typing this, but detached, outside the world itself, and growing huge in relation to it. Another person was standing at the crossroads of time and space, shirtless, shoeless, but dressed in a nice suit, on the outside looking in, curious, but indifferent to being and not being, both of which he understood as accidental and impossible. The free person, the truly free from time, space, the world. It's hard to know if this quizzical spectator, shirtless, shoeless, but dressed in a nice suit, on the outside looking in, is the poet or his father, free from time, space, the world. But the apparition's arrival is beyond doubt. Don't roll your eyes, Seshadri admonishes his audience. This was actually happening. That Was Now, This Is Then is Seshadri's most haunted and philosophical work to date. Haunted not only by his father's death, but by the almost seductive prospect of his own mortality, which in consequence appears not as tragedy, but as farce in this breathtaking plunge from the poem Soliloquy. Why, on a puddle jumper from one mid-size Midwestern city to another, do I watch myself, unbuckling my seatbelt, creeping down the aisle, wrenching counterclockwise the emergency exit's cold, recalcitrant shank, kicking open the door to the beautiful and spacious skies, and plunging 5 miles down past the goshawks rising on their thermals, plunging to America and its billowing farms with fields dotted here and there with big lozenges of hay wrapped in white plastic, moist with the morning dew. The death drive and the pleasure principle somersault through Seshadri's propulsive enjambments and artful end stops. You can feel the exhilaration and terror of free fall as we zoom in from farms with fields dotted here and there to those big lozenges of hay wrapped in white plastic, moist with morning dew. Seshadri may look a little like a Chaplin-esque, or better, Keaton-esque skeptic in such slapstick scenarios. But he dusts himself off in the midst of each performance to speak at the threshold of Western philosophical and Eastern religious traditions. I've heard it said, I've heard it is written, I've read of it, and I've understood by reason's light within me that the moment I'm speaking of stretches across eternity and never moves on to become the next moment. And to be suspended inside it is to see our pinpoint presence among the stars reversed, and the stars themselves coalescing into a perfect orb small enough to hold in the palm of your hand, from the center of which being shall look into your eyes. Dante saw creation from the outside looking in, but he never saw being itself gaze back at him from his cosmic orb. Krishna's mother saw the multiverse in her child's open mouth, but she re-entered time, narrative, and history with a blink of the eye, instead of dwelling eternally inside the moment that never moves on to become the next moment. Seshadri's verse discovers forms of language to express and understand what he calls the sensible storm of non-being. He continues and extends the philosophical and literary tradition of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Wallace Stevens, and John Ashbery into contemporary American and Anglophone Indian writing in this respect. Stevens may have written of nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. This poet gives expression to what there is and also is. Vijay Seshadri is the author of 4 books of poetry: Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, which won the James Laughlin Award in 2003, 3 Sections, which won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry, and That Was Now, This Is Then. A former editor at the Paris Review and the New Yorker, an essayist and book reviewer in the New York Times Book Review, the American Scholar, and many other literary quarterlies, and recipient of the MacDowell Colony's Fellowship for Distinguished Poetic Achievement, the Paris Review's Bernard F. Connors Long Poem Prize, and grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Seshadri currently teaches at Sarah Lawrence College, where he's a writing faculty member in the nonfiction program. Please join me in welcoming Vijay Seshadri to the University of Chicago.
Thank you, Chiku. And I want to thank the Phoenix Poetry Series for inviting me, and it's great to be back in Chicago. I brought the warm weather with me, and I'm going to take it away, supposedly. Now, should I stand or should I sit here? What is like, I don't know. Sit? Yeah, there is a bench. Is this, I don't know. Oh, okay. I thought it was actually bolted to the floor, and I had to, because it was pushing up against my butt. It was like a little, So I brought a really long poem that I'm working on. And I also have another really long poem from 3 sections that I've never read out loud. But I'm not going to read either of those poems. I'm just going to read from my book, my latest book, which came out during COVID, so I never got a chance to go around and read from it, and and the poems are always crying out to me when I go to a reading like this, read me, Vijay, you've never read me, and it's like, so I'm just going to start at the beginning and then see where to go from there, where the mood takes me. And Chiku is right, this is a poem that's sort of at the center. It's kind of concerned with the death of my parents, and it was kind of interesting to me that when they died, it was that my experience of it had nothing to do with all of the things I had thought about death for so long, that the experience was very, very different. And I finally understood what the purpose of thinking is in poetry. The purpose of thinking in poetry is, the purpose of emotionist poetry is not to get to thought, but the purpose of thinking in poetry is to get to emotion, and I think I was always kind of confused about that as a poet. It was sort of a little mysterious to me to know which of the forking paths I should take, and then with this book, I think it became really clear. And I don't know if that makes it a better book than my other books, or maybe a worse book than my other books, but it sort of gave me a whole new set of ways to think about what we do when we write, and like what our ultimate goal is going to be, what our condition and our situation is going to be, and and what the ultimate payoff should be for us as writers. So with that said, I'll start reading some of the poems. This is the first poem. It's called Road Trip. Road Trip. I could complain, I've done it before. I could explain, I could say, for instance, that I'm sick of being slaughtered in my life's mountain passes, covering my own long retreat, the rear guard of my own brutal defeat, dysentery and frostbite and snipers, the mules freezing to death, blizzards whipping the famished fires until they expire, the pathetic mosquito notes of my horn. But instead, for once, I'm keeping quiet, and maybe tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe the day after that, I'm just going to drive away down the coast and not come back. I haven't told anyone, and I won't. I won't dim with words the radiance of my gesture. And besides, the ones who care have guessed already. Looking at them, looking at me, I know they know when they turn their backs, I'll go. The secrets I was planning to floor them with, they're already packed in my trunk, in straw, in a reinforced casket. The bitter but herbal and medicinal truths I concocted to revive them with, tomorrow or the day after that, on the volcano beaches fringed with black sand and heaped with tangled beds of kelp, by the obsidian tide pools that cradled the ribbed limpet and the rock-bound star. I'll scatter those truths to the sea breezes and float the secrets on the waters that the moon reels in and plays out, with a little votive candle burning on their casket. And then I'll just be there, in the sunset's coppery sheen, in the dawn pearled by discreet, oblong, intimate clouds that move without desire or motive. Look at the clouds. Look how close they are. When I moved to New York in 1982 to go to graduate school at Columbia, and I immediately, I think the first time I voted was when McGovern was the Democratic candidate in 1972, which, and I just turned 18. And I always voted in every presidential election after that, and a lot of the elections in between. So, and I'm take my duties as an American citizen seriously, like any good immigrant. And so I registered to vote. And when you register to vote, in New York City, they put you on the jury rolls, and they write to you and ask you to do jury duty. So a couple of years later, I got a notice to go down, and I was living in Manhattan, to go down to the, that area of Lower Manhattan where they film Law and Order, if you ever saw that TV show. And it was not convenient, and I was really worried that I was going to get chosen, and I went down, and they didn't choose me. And then a few years later, the last year I was in Manhattan, I got another notice, and I went down, and they didn't choose me again. And then we moved to Brooklyn. 3 or 4 years later, I got another notice, and I went down, and they didn't choose me. And the third time I said, well, why? What's wrong with me? And I thought, well, maybe it's because I'm a person of color. But they were choosing other people of color, obviously, and sending them to the voir dire. And then it happened again about 5 years later. I've been living in New York a long, long time. And I thought, maybe it's because I'm an Indian, And then it happened again. And I said, no, it's not any of this social stuff. It's just me. They don't want me, They make me come down and waste a whole day sitting there, and then they tell me to go home. And so, in response to the last time I wrote this poem, it's called Commas, Dashes, Ellipses, Full Stops, Question Marks. People restless on the pews downtown, people not of the book or of the book, itchy and introspective in the big cross-section of humanity room in the courthouse on Adams Street. Apothecaries, scriveners, gendarmes, recidivists. 60% are happy 65% of the time. 30% are okay 79% of the time. One is angry. That's what the bulletins from the ether say. And maybe we'll do something about it. But not today. Today is another day. Today is the day the self's whispering to itself in its 100 endangered languages merges with the sound of water running and scoring grooves in the damp, lithic, adhesive interiors, the limestone cavern of being where flying mammals hang and nurse their young and contemplate upside down the inscape person waiting to be called out of himself into the light of reason, to be impaneled on a jury here, right here in Brooklyn, so he can judge lest he not be judged, but forgiven, just forgiven. Grace, with no instinct to explain itself, pouring out of every portal. Are you blind that you can't see it? I am. I guess I am. Communion, submission, detachment. And what would I rather be doing than sitting here, pretending not to look at the rest of you, of the city and of the world, so compelling is your exhausted, disillusioned, but steadfast commitment to the mechanisms of justice, the apparatus of democracy. 12 good persons and true will be summoned from the cardinal points to, but not me, I guess. The bailiff is saying, go home, not you, not today. For the 100th time I have been called but not chosen. For the 100th time I have to shuffle into the subway station at J Street, where a tall, sweet-looking, willowy violinist is playing the chaconne with apocalyptic focus and the ghost of a smile on her lips. Maybe she will say yes to me. Maybe I can stay with her always. Maybe I can sleep on my hands at her little desk. I'd rather go blind than to walk away from you, child. This one is called Meeting. I'll meet if you really want to meet. I'll even meet in some small cafe or some park across the way. But I won't meet for long, and not for a minute will I look at you in your isolation, your human isolation. Looking at yours makes me look at mine. Transparencies of each other are they, yours and mine, and I don't have time for mine, so how could I have time for yours? When I knew you, I had time for mine. When I knew you, imagining my skeletal, streaming, oceanic, solitary swimming enlarged my dignities. Not anymore. No time for the nostalgias, infinite, infinitesimal, and the ones in between. No time to pretend I can sustain anyone or even understand how they feel. To show by the grave downward turn of the face, the haunted eyes, the image of an impossible, inward, stricken empathy. The contradictions are unsupportable, and I don't have time to not support mine. So how could I not support yours, too? I don't even have time to write this text. See how uninflected it is. Without rhetoric, expatiation, form, concreteness, geography, weather, flora, fauna, plain and bare, which shows you that I'm sincere. No Denali, no great rift, no 7-year trillium, and not one Phoebe in the woods getting ready to sing. This next one is my one Peanuts poem. People still read Peanuts, right? Charlie Brown, Lucy. Okay, good. I never know anymore, you know. It's like I mentioned Fleetwood Mac to my undergraduates recently. They'd never heard a Fleetwood Mac song. I couldn't believe it, you know. I was saying Christine McVeigh is so much better than, what's her name? Who's,
Stevie Nicks.
Huh?
Stevie Nicks.
No, the current. Why am I blanking on her name? You know who I mean. She just put out an album, and she's everywhere. What?
Taylor Swift.
What?
Taylor Swift.
What? Taylor Swift. Yeah, Taylor Swift. Why did Although Taylor Swift is actually a pretty good songwriter, I think. It's songwriting by committee. I think Christine McVeigh wrote her own songs, but, now there's some guy in Scandinavia, right? There's some Swedish guy who writes all these songs. And, then the artists have input, I guess. Anyway, this is my Peanuts poem. Nemesis. Your airplane is pulling out its stops. Your airplane is growling with its props, pawing the tarmac with its landing gear, streaming exhaust. That one sortie is here that you've been fearfully anticipating. 12 o'clock high, the Red Baron is waiting in a holding pattern behind the sun. His mind is focused as his Gatling gun, inviting you there up to the skies, you, his one absent precious prize. He wants to silence your persiflage, to put your picture on his fuselage. He wants his mind relieved of you. He wants his gun to talk to you, embracing the murderous dialogue. He doesn't care that you're just a dog. So yeah, the center of this book has elegies, and I'm going to read a couple. Well, I won't read the one to my father, but I'll read the one to my mother that I wrote before she died. And I think it was appropriate. It was in the months that she was dying, and I was her primary caregiver. My father had died the year before, and I had been their primary caregiver through a long period of time. She wasn't the kind of woman for whom an elegy was appropriate, because she was just so vital, and you couldn't. And she was amazingly affronted by death. I mean, the idea that something like this would happen to her was just unthinkable to her, you know. So I left it this way. Your living eyes. They wheeled you, your caregivers did, to the picture window to watch the birds fretting at the feeder. Then they forgot you, and you forgot them. 1,000 years later, the angel of death sidled in, disguised as a little girl, clutching at her pinafore and chewing the ends of her pigtails. She had a look whose vacancy was over-rehearsed. But I hear your interview with her went well anyway. I hear actually that it went better than anybody could ever have thought it would. She said, beauty and sadness are never far apart. You said, bullshit. She said, some birds are real, some are invisible, but which are which? You said, back off, bitch. She stared out the window. Her eyes narrowed, but they didn't touch. What was she seeing? What was she saying to herself? Do I know, or do I care? Enough with these impassive forces. This one or that other one, the one who gave you life, you who gave me life. The yellow of the finches is as molten as ever, splashing on the holly bushes. The moon, pale white inside the pale blue morning, dropping its panicles of glass on the bright grass, is climbing down. But the sun is climbing up. The world your eyes see is the world as it really is, and you and I are going to live in it forever. And we will hitchhike to the painted hills together and hop a freight back home. And this one's called Cliffhanging. It's from my friend Tom Lux, wonderful American poet who was always a very, very, very good friend to me from the time I was 19 on. And, you know, that person who constantly encouraged me, it's great to have someone like that who's sort of, you know, and cliffhanging. The forces out to kill us with their benevolence are more crazed now than they were when you were alive. And more focused, too. Our ingratitude excites them. They're bubbling with remedies. Their providential impulses are a nimbus of knives. Their need to tell us they love us, with all their love in vain. You said before you died that this would happen. Thanks for the warning. You didn't let me know, though, that even our phantom selves would come after us, crawling out of the poems we made. They don't care about the transparent skin we wrapped them in so they could watch their organs pulsing within. All they know is that we made their eyes too bright. They see more than they can stand, more than we ever could or would. They see the unending savagery that we could never really bear to see, and so we consigned our sight to them. They hate us for it. They've cut the phone lines and are chainsawing the front door. I'm a little worried about myself because all this hostility from every quarter bothers me much less than it should. Why the disconnect? I can't figure it out. And it's long past time to take precautions. The great wave that breaks through the crust of the world is rising and lifting me far inland, only to suck me back and drop me dangling by one arm on the edge of the half-eaten cliff. I won't let myself fall, but I don't want to pull myself up. I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent forever now. But if you were here looking down on me and saying, grab my hand, I would, I know, I surely would. On a lighter note, somewhat, I Went to Seattle, I think in 2016, and I called up an old girlfriend, and I thought, we could get together. She was living there, and she didn't want to see me. So I was kind of, what do you do when that happens if you're a poet? Yeah. You get a poem out of it, right? And that's kind of, but I transposed the poem to San Francisco because it's a more poetic town for me. And I'd never lived in Seattle, I'd lived in San Francisco. And there was a girl there too, who, I knew better by then, so when I went to San Francisco, I didn't call her up. Yeah. This is the poem, it's called Visiting San Francisco. I wanted to curl up in the comfortable cosmic melancholy of my past, in the sadness of my past being past. I wanted to tour the museum of my antiquities and look at the sarcophagi there. I wanted to wallow like a water buffalo in the cool, sagacious mud of my past. So I wrote you and said I'd be in town and could we meet? But you think my past is your present. You wouldn't relent. You wouldn't agree to dinner or a cup of coffee or even a bag of peanuts on a bench in North Beach. You didn't want to curl up or tour or wallow with me. You're still mad long after the days have turned into decades about the ways I let you down, the 400,000 ways. Maybe I would be too. But people have done worse to me. I don't think I'm being grotesque when I tell you I've been flayed and slayed in force-fed anguish. I've been a human cataract plunging through a noose and going to pieces on the rocks. I've been a seagull tethered to Alcatraz. What can I say? What more can I say? How much more vulnerable can I be to persuade you now that I've persuaded myself? Why can't you just let it go? Well, at least I'm in San Francisco. San Francisco, where the homeless are most at home, crouching over their tucker bags under your pollarded trees, because your beauty is as free to them as to the domiciled in their deadbolt domiciles. Your beauty is as free to the innocent as to the guilty. The fog is burned off. In a cheap and windy room on Russian Hill, a man on the run unwraps the bandages swaddling his new face, his reconstructed face, and looks in the mirror and sees the face of Humphrey Bogart. Only here could such a thing happen. It was really always you, San Francisco. Time won't ever darken my love for you, San Francisco. And I'll read two more, and then we'll have the Q&A. Is that, or maybe just one or two? Two's fine? Okay, good. This one's called Who Is This Guy? Now that I'm dead too, just like the living dead on TV, fat chance that the merely living will be saved by doing what they did when I was merely living, nailing their doors shut against me, hurricane-proofing the windows, positioning snipers at the embrasures. Now that I have a dead army too, fat chance for the living, for the strength of my dead legions is the eternal and irrepressible strength of non-being, the terrified being into birthing the world, and then licked the afterbirth clean until the world gleamed with nothingness. Fat chance for the living in the face of that. Quail they will in the sensible storm of non-being, and weep will they in the face of my dead army's weapons, not guns and sharp swords, but the residual fragrances of their lives on earth, the leftover aromatics of the dead, time bombs, memories' mines and memories' fields, each memory wrapped in a fragrance, each memory a drop of time around which a translucent agate is formed, redolent with what was left behind when its owners vanished. A molecule of honeysuckle, and it is that summer night. The long shadows, the risen full moon casts a veil of leaf shadows over a face. The eyes swim up at you. Then an odor of roses, but powdery and particulate. A stewardess at the dawn of the age of universal jet travel. Your mother holds your hand in hers. You will be given biscuits in foil and chocolates made in a country called Switzerland. Then the burning maple leaves. Then the faint odor of tin before the monsoon sweeps in. Then the torrents in the gutter and the smashed mango pods. Then the rainbow. Then the rich, delicious mildew of the trailer on the floodplain. You forgot yourself there. You never afterwards remembered what you forgot, never recollected yourself. You will recollect yourself now in these fragrances, the indices of memory and the engines of my dead army. Now will the living know what they were meant to mean, and they will know that what they've lost isn't lost at all, but is there, right there, dancing on the other side of time. What they were and what it was, what it meant and what it means, just on the other side of time. The confusion can't be endured. The longing is as if it were a knife, and for that longing alone, piercing and inevitable, the living, the beautiful living, would, if I weren't already dead, kill me again and again. And this is the last poem. It's the last poem in the book. It's called To the Reader, and you can modify it in your own minds to the listener. But I'm not going to change the poem. To the Reader. I'm writing this so I can tell you that what you're thinking about me is exactly what I'm thinking about you. What you're reading is exactly what you're writing, by the light of a taper deep inside yourself at your walnut secretary. These words are saying what those words say, and these and those are those and these, mine and yours, and have no meaning, only form. Talk about being one with others. We correspond one to one, and there is a grandeur in this. You'll understand that someday. Just now, though, you're stupefied at this spooky action at a distance. So would I be, and I am. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vijay. That was great. And we have a little time for maybe a little conversation and questions from the audience too. So if you have questions for Vijay, just raise your hand, and I'll try not to ignore you all while I ask Vijay my own questions, because I always want to talk to him about writing. So one thing that I felt especially, I mean, I've always felt with your writing, but more and more with Three Sets in this book is like a kind of philosophical kind of searching in the poems, or the poem as a kind of like vehicle for philosophical reflection. That's actually not just reflection, it's very urgent oftentimes. But then it happens within like a poem about a zombie movie, or there's always a kind of comic, oftentimes like there's a philosophical comedy happening in the poems, and I really heard that again in the zombie poem tonight. And so just wondering if there's even a way to answer. Like, do you feel like that the philosophizing that's happening in the poems is philosophy when you're writing it, or are you staging it within comedy to do a kind of comedy, a satire of that kind of thought? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the question is sort of one that's a little vexed for poets, I think, because the use of anything in a poem is somewhat opportunistic, and I was just reading a new prose translation of Lucretius, and I hadn't read him in a long, long time, and Lucretius, even though this translation is in prose, is really a poet. He's not, he's transmitting a philosophy. He's transmitting Epicureanism, and he's kind of one of the few people we know Epicureanism through, but it's once removed in a way from actual philosophical issues and problems, I mean, I think the way it comes back around to me is that there's something that kind of all human inquiry shares, and it has something to do with trying to manifest or realize in yourself the mystery of the thing that we're actually all involved in, and poets who can bring me to that. Whitman can certainly do it. Elizabeth Bishop, I think, does it in a transcendent way and in The Waiting Room, where she, really kind of brings us very close to, what's been called since the pre-Socratics the question of being. Why is there something instead of nothing at all? And that's a dead question to us most of the time, right? But every once in a while it just springs upon us. Or when you suddenly look at yourself and you say, and that happened to me, I looked at myself in the mirror before I came here to see that, there wasn't anything hanging on various parts of my body, to gross you guys out. And I said, that's me, that's what they're going to be looking at. They're going to be looking at this image and they're going to be seeing that, and how weird is that? How weird is that when you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, wow. Because yourself as a consciousness, right? Yourself mostly in terms of your internal processes. You're not really, even if you're a supermodel and are looking at yourself all the time, it's actually what's going on in your mind that's significant to you, and that constitutes who you think you are. And then there's this strange thing called dimension and extension, and and for me it's not philosophical, but it's a weird, dumb, instinctive awareness of those pressures, the pressures of those questions. And I studied philosophy, but somehow it never got me any closer to scratching that itch in a way that was satisfying, and I think sort of, does that answer, I mean?
No, I mean, it totally doesn't answer the question, but it's sort of interesting to hear you talk about it, because it does feel like those profound, I mean, I think there are more moments of like kind of, I don't like this term, but cosmic
right.
kind of dimensions or an awareness or dread at kind of magnitudes of time and space in the poems that is terrifying, but always kind of is held in check by a sense of the absurd, the absurdity of looking at yourself in the mirror and thinking, why that face? Or you mentioned the Elizabeth Bishop poem. There's that moment where she feels like the waiting room becomes a wave cresting under her. And there's a moment in the Thomas Lux elegy where there's a kind of, reality becomes a wave underfoot. It's quite dreadful. But it's always, to me, there's something that feels like Buster, like the speaker's like a Buster Keaton in that situation, not a Hamlet or
Yeah. Well, I mean, Buster Keaton was a profound. I mean, those situations he creates. Like, there's that one short where he gets up out of a subway and he goes up the stairs and he winds up in the North Pole, or like everything is like, I mean,
that would happen in a poem of yours, actually.
Right? Yeah, that kind of thing is, those are sort of shifts and changes that I think, I've been reviewed by people who seem to be chastising me for being ironic, right? And that this is not a moment when we're supposed to be ironic and we're supposed to be serious, right? But this seems to be the perfect moment for being ironic. This seems to be, I gave a talk recently on Auden, and in the most terrible time politically in the world he was living in, the late 30s, early 40s, was when the irony became intense, and then it became very, very unstable because he went overboard with it and stuff like that. And, and of course the word irony comes from the Greek word for dissembling, right? For saying one thing and meaning something else. And, and we seem to be immersed in the ironic. We're always saying something and meaning something else these days. We're kind of in a situation where language is splitting apart from inside ourselves in these ways. And I think a lot of the things that are sort of humorous and are destabilizing and are moments when people might be thinking, well, is he serious saying this? What is he actually saying? Really, I think there's probably where there's a degree of philosophical depth, because I want to create a degree of instability of meaning on the page, and I don't want people to know exactly how to take this, how to kind of, because I think meaning does have a slight instability to it. I think meaning is meaning, and I think there are truths and there are falsehoods and stuff like that. I'm totally into truth, I'm not, opposed to it at all in any way. And, no, the election wasn't stolen. It's so obvious, right? Come on. It has a complexity to it. And the other thing is that how do you get in a poem, in a piece of literature, at these things that are imponderable but so alive to you that, like, when you feel them, Virginia Woolf calls them moments of being, right? And Wordsworth, and she gets that from the Prelude, where he calls them spots in time, right? That, there's all of this kind of cotton wadding of life, and then there are these moments of incredible clarity, overwhelming clarity. And you might sort of see in those moments existential dread, but then the alternative to that, numbness and unawareness, a lack of consciousness of the condition we find ourselves in, seems to be far worse to me. And so, and I think I've always known why I wanted to write poetry, and I've always understood the impulse that I want to somehow get to those moments. And if I can't quite do it, I can at least keep trying, Yes?
Yeah, I have a question that actually, just now your last remark about, understanding why you're writing poetry, makes me think about, is this working? Okay. Your opening remark about this new book marking a turn for you in approaching a poem rather than working from emotion toward thought, now working from thought toward emotion. And that's thematized in many of the poems where you talk about a disconnect or being bothered by not being bothered, or a desire to wallow in a feeling. There's obviously a thematized like urge toward feeling.
Right.
But also I thought it was really interesting in terms of the way your imagery works. I felt like there was a lot of imagery that functions figuratively, or there's a kind of conceit unfolding. Like the opening poem, I think, sort of figures the self as like a military assault or retreat, and there's kind of an elaborated conceit, which happens in a few poems. In that first poem, it seemed to me, if I'm remembering it correctly, to move from a kind of, conceit is a process of thinking, right? It's a cognitive kind of imagery, maybe less about describing and perceiving something right in front of you, but kind of doing the kind of like metaphysical workings out in thought and philosophy. But that poem then arcs in the end, if I'm remembering right, to kind of a feeling of wonder at just looking at clouds on an actual beach, not a figurative beach.
Right.
Actual clouds, actual contact with like the wonder of look how close they are. And that seemed like to kind of map through the way images work, that kind of trajectory. So I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about description and imagery vis-a-vis feeling and cognition, I guess, or thinking.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a really good question, Suzanne, because that image was one that I had hoarded for many, many years, the image at the end. And, I used to live on the Oregon coast. I lived there for 5 years. And I lived in a place, called South Beach, right below Yaquina Bay. And I remembered that I used to walk on that beach all the time. I lived on a cliff overlooking that beach. And I remember one day there was a kind of background of clouds, and then there were these cumulonimbus clouds that were really close. I mean, it just seemed like somehow the scale of things had been transformed. And either I'd gotten large, so much larger that I was suddenly close to them, or they had come so close to the earth. But they were distinct clouds. It wasn't a fog or anything like that. Everything was sharply edged, and that image never left me. It's always been such a strong, strong image. And our minds are, I think, filled with images like that, and we just store them without even realizing it. And, so in some sense, I think that poem, it actually, even though I wrote it on the East Coast, it has a West Coast geography. I'm going to drive away down the coast and not come back. That's what somebody says is in Portland or in, the Willamette Valley somewhere. They're going to drive away down the coast. You don't say that. You're not in, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and say, I'm going to drive away down the coast, meaning the New Jersey coast. It's not, And so the moment I said I'm going to drive away down the coast and not come back, a whole set of associated images having to do with tide pools and piles of kelp on the beach, and and then those clouds just they formed in my mind. And so anything that's philosophical there is a bridge to those images, right? Anything that can be construed as my fashioning propositions about the nature of the world somehow, or implying propositions about the nature of the world, is just a means to spring the image, right? And I think I always knew that about the image, that the image was primary, because I grew up in a very imagistic, poetic culture. Williams had just recently died. There was deep imagism. The whole idea in the 60s, in the revolution of the 60s, was to strip the poem down in order to produce not necessarily feeling, but an image. And that really kind of dominated my early education in poetry. And so I never really thought too much about, the feeling was sort of natural to me, and I didn't necessarily valorize it, in the way that lots of poets in America do, and rightly so, because I always felt like, well, if you valorize it, and I think this has something to do with the way in which our teaching tends to contaminate our writing ourselves, because, you're teaching, and, if you tell people that it's all about, feeling, you're just gonna get, all these poems about grandmothers and how I love my grandmother and stuff like that. And we've seen all those poems and stuff like that. And we all love our grandmothers, and we all feel for our grandmothers, and our feelings are very common in some way. That, the issue, the rhetorical issue, the issue of poetics always seemed to me to have to do with something else. And I guess I would say that, to release the image. I mean, there's that great quote from Goethe that Randall Jarrell uses, that it's better to think than to do, better to feel than to think, but best of all, merely to look. And that really was kind of a motto for me for a long time. And I don't think it is anymore. I don't know if I could come up with a motto anymore. I guess everyone needs a motto, right? But I don't have one. I'm motto-less. Anyway, anything else? I love Q&A if you guys have any questions. As you can tell, I can just go on and on and on. But yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful reading. A theme that I noticed throughout, even in the introduction, which was partly about a poem that you didn't read, the presence of these selves that are attached from the speaking voice. Wow. I think in the soliloquy it's very intentional, or if that's what it is called, it's very intentionally distanced and dramatized. And I think in the jury duty poem you say the inscaped self waiting to be called out. And I wrote down another one. Anyway, sorry, I can't find it now. But I was wondering how that works within this sort of paradigm of getting more towards the emotion and away from thought, because it seems, at least to me, when I do that sort of mechanism in poetry, it seems to try to bring myself closer to thinking, and maybe away from feeling, to distance myself like that. Yeah. So I was just wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say in response to that is that complexity and deep feeling are not inconsistent, that in fact complexity of a certain order enhances deep feeling, and a high degree of complexity can, I don't know if people still read John Ashbery, they don't listen to Christine McVeigh, and they don't read John Ashbery anymore. This is what's happened, in my world. But if they do, like I'm teaching a master class at Columbia, and I brought in an Ashbery poem called Wet Casements from Houseboat Days, which I think is his best book, and Wet Casements is really about erotic frustration. But it's such a complex poem, and it's syntactically complex. It's just, it evades any sort of paraphrase. It seems to be quintessentially an intellectual poem, right? And it seems to be directed toward a coterie reading public, right? The people who are
really cool and understand what abstraction is in poetry and stuff like that. But that's not really what's going on in the poem. What's going on in the poem is that he's getting to a certain kind of feeling which is very, very intense for him. And the eros of the poem and the way eros is represented in the poem is really quite extraordinary, you know. I mean, he has this long, elaborate sentence. I can't, you know. In the center of that poem, I wish I could remember it and quote it, you know. And then after this long, complicated piece of syntax with many, many subordinate clauses, he says, at the end of that stanza that is the first stanza of that poem, he says, I want that information very much today, you know? And that very much today just explodes, you know? It's just amazing how forceful it is and how forceful it is in its representation of the erotic frustration he's feeling, you know? Can't have it and this makes me angry, you know? And you can really feel the anger coming out of the poem. And you think about, well, what is Ashbery doing in terms of what the representation of feeling actually is in a poem, right there. And he brings up the question of how do you represent feeling with words, you know? How is feeling rendered in such a way as to make it real? Rather than just telling us that you're feeling something, which is what often happens in poetry, you know? You're not feeling the feeling, you're being told that the poet is having the feeling, you know? And you're supposed to approve. Right, which is very different from that Ashbery poem. It's very different from a Sylvia Plath poem where, you know, she is engaged in symbolic action that allows you in some way to participate in the anger she's experiencing. You know, that the rhetorical function does not have to do with her telling, but her showing in some way. And so, and those Sylvia Plath poems, to use another example from away from Ashbery, are, I think, remarkably complex. They're a high degree, you know, they're really very much in the tradition of symbolism that goes back to Mallarmé, and you can kind of see them developing out of that. And you know, so they have all of this literary quality, they have this literary sophistication, they have intellectual sophistication, you know, they have elements that are philosophical. They're dramatically complex. The dramaturgy, as, you know, to use one of Chiku's words, is really beautifully articulated. And then there's this, you know, and then there's this, you know, daddy, oh daddy, you bastard, I'm through, right? That's there too, but how is that made effective? You know, how is it that a poem like that is made really effective in that way? And what are the choices the poet has made? And if you look into it, you see, well, this is a poet writing at a very, very high order of sophistication. And it's almost accidental, you know? And of course, Sylvia Plath is someone who is read for all the wrong reasons, and she's not read for the reason she should be read, I don't think, you know, which is that she's a poet who resembles in many ways Wallace Stevens, you know, that's the kind of companion you should associate her with. You know? But people would say, oh, Wallace Stevens is dry, he's difficult, he's, you know, but Wallace Stevens, of course, is full of passion, you know. Go on, high ship, since now upon the shore the snake has left its skin upon the floor. The moon is at the masthead and the past is dead. Her mind will never speak to me again. I mean, come on, you know. It's fantastic. It's like, you know. Anyway.
Hey, Professor, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. I really enjoyed listening to your poems. I was actually wondering about a comment that you made earlier when you just offhandedly said you weren't sure if your latest book was your best or maybe your worst because of some particular trait. And I was kind of wondering, as like a creative writing major, as like a new poet, how do you measure the progress of your poems individually, like when you're just revising them, or just in general throughout your career? How do you tell that like you're improving?
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that is a tough question. However you think of yourself as a poet that is somehow conforming to a set of cultural standards that are outside yourself, and there are kind of things that you develop and hold dear that they become the equivalent of your own personal creed. I mean, for me, for example, clarity and distinctness, which comes out of Descartes, right? Descartes wants to know what the truth is because he's undermined, all of the bases that, people have for truth. He said, well, then how do I know if anything is true? And he says, well, if it's clear and distinct. And he has to do a little fudging, He has to say if he has to bow to the scholastics and say, well, if it's clear and distinct, then, God, who isn't mischievous and is fooling me, has guaranteed its truth somehow, then. And he doesn't really believe that argument. He's just interested in clarity and distinction. And I think that was always, I always moved toward a poetry that had clarity and distinctness to it, in terms of images and in terms of like something that was rounded and stuff. And that is a collective standard. It's not a standard individual to me. There is a paradigm of clarity. And that's sort of something that I could measure myself against and see that I was getting closer and closer. And that if you are doing what Auden calls clear speaking about confusing things, right, then you've sort of done your job in some way. But then also you have to kind of recognize that reality itself has this ambiguity to it. So there's only so far you can go to clarity. And I always felt like, I was never really a poet who was going to go out and have lunch with someone and then come back and write a poem about it, And there's a whole tradition of poetry where that is considered just the everyday and the everydayness and stuff, and the almost journalistic idea of poetry, and how that works and how that doesn't, I couldn't quite tell you. If I read a poet like Eileen Myles, who I like very much, I wouldn't quite know how she knows the poem is working and how she, But with her, I would say, with someone like Eileen, it's sort of, I'm really getting my person down on the page. I'm getting, the person that I am down on the page. Not an idea of myself that I have, not an idea of myself that others have, but what is actually the structure of the movements of my mind are now being embodied in this language in a certain way. So there is a reflection of something internal that is external, and the poem might start and it might stop rather than a poem begin and develop and end, but it is an embodiment of my consciousness. And I think you feel those things, you know. Yeah, and the way to do it, you know, it's just that whole 10,000 hour thing. Do it for 10,000 hours and you'll have the answer to your own question, you know, basically. I mean, I don't think you need 10,000 hours. That's like the 10,000 steps, right? You're supposed to take 10,000 steps a day. Then the Times comes along and says, well, no, you don't need to take 10,000 steps. You can take 8,000, that'll be fine, you know. There was this guy in Japan that said 10,000 and everybody said, okay, it's going to be 10,000, but, you know, so anyway.
Thanks, Vijay.
Yeah.
So now we actually know how, I don't know how many steps to take anymore, but
Yeah.
that was great. Any, yeah, I think we'll call it an event so that there's time for people to talk to Vijay after the reading. And please join us tomorrow as well for a conversation with Rachel Cohen and Vijay Seshadri on the poetics of nonfiction. One thing many of you may not know is that Vijay actually for many years and to many people is known as a writer of nonfiction, literary nonfiction, essays, and so tomorrow Vijay is going to talk with our resident nonfiction expert Rachel about the poetics of nonfiction at 1 o'clock. Is it? 2:30. 2:30. And is that in Taft or in the experimental station? Oh, yeah. So please join us in the experimental station tomorrow for these events. It's going to be a really great afternoon and evening of poetry and conversations. And thank you again, Vijay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.